In a society so widely extended as Freemasonry, the branches of which are extended over the 4 quarters of the globe, it cannot be denied that we have many members of rank and opulence.
During his initiation, every apprentice Mason is told that Freemasonry is a moral organization. Three guiding principles are brotherly love, relief, and truth.
In more modern terms, you could probably describe them as brotherly love, tolerating other people's ideas, getting on with people whether they hold the same ideas as you or not. Relief, charity in its widest sense, not just giving money, but giving of your time, your talents, your expertise within the community as a whole. And truth, striving to be as truthful as you can in your dealings with other people, in the way you carry out your daily life, and sort of acting squarely with people.
But these sentiments have a hollow ring for some disillusioned Masons.
Brotherly love, relief, and truth has been replaced by envy, hypocrisy, and lies.
It will be thankfully received and faithfully applied.
Have you anything to give in the cause of charity?
I have to give my talents to the masonry.
Were you deprived of everything valuable previously to entering the lodge?
Yes.
If you had not been so deprived, would you give freely?
Yes, I would.
Worshipful Master.
A brother is asked for money, for charity, and they make sure he has none. And they say to him, you will remember that peculiar moment when you were first admitted into Freemasonry, figuratively poor and penniless. Now then, I know that that is done to impress the charitable work of Freemasons. But there's men at the top don't give money. When I was the charity rep, I had a write job to get from the top Freemasons, Grand Lodge officers, £5 a year. I had to write to them sometimes 3 times.
I command of you, worshipful Master, I give you the tireless toast. To all poor and distressed Freemasons where'er dispersed over the face of earth and water.
Tonight, we examine 3 cases which call into question Masonry's claims of brotherly love and truth.
To all poor and distressed Freemasons.
And we look at Freemasonry's record on charity. Masonic charity is not like rattling collecting cans on street corners. Each member is expected to give what he can afford, and Freemasonry is like a big mutual assurance fund, with most of what Masons give to charity going to fellow Masons or their families who've fallen on hard times. They raise money for Masons' widows and children, for a Masonic school, and for charities serving the Masonic aged and sick. They have their own hospital, the Royal Masonic in London. For these holy Masonic causes, the Brotherhood's charities in England and Wales collect and expend around £16 million each year. But recently, local newspapers have been deluged with hundreds of stories about Freemasons' gifts to non-Masonic charities. Apparently, the Masons are building a new image, as the Kent Evening Post reported in June 1987, when Masons handed a cheque to a Chatham hospital.
Masons have been told to build a new image and go public on some of their good works.
Increasingly today, Freemasonry gives from the money it raises to non-Masonic causes. This minibus was presented to help the aged by Masons in the...
Armed with their own public relations video, rank-and-file Masons now emphasize a new outward-looking image.
Freemasonry in this country and throughout the world has done a great deal towards the community. And no more can this be seen than in the question of the amount of money that Freemasonry gives to charities which have nothing whatsoever to do with Freemasonry. As you will know, they've given £250,000 to the Great Ormond Street Appeal.
But we've discovered that of every £20 collected and spent in 1988 by English Freemasonry's national charities, £19 went on Masons or their dependents and just £1 to non-Masonic charities. Out of a total of £16 million, only £800,000 went to other causes. So despite their new image, the Brethren, it seems, still prefer to look after their own. The Masons have been cleaning up their image for a more particular reason, to fight mounting opposition from Christians. In 1986, while a Church of England inquiry was trying to decide whether Freemasonry was incompatible with Christianity, the Brotherhood announced it was giving sums of £5,000 to Salisbury and 3 other cathedrals. Since then, many more cathedrals have each been given £5,000. Masons say this is to help save Britain's architectural heritage and to honour the stonemasons from whom they claim descent, but Anglican priest John Lawrence is not convinced.
It's a strange coincidence that as Freemasonry has been seen in rather a bad light recently by the Church of England, that they're now giving more money to it. Now, is it to cull favour? Well, I suppose everybody has their own opinions on that. I would ask, why don't they give it secretly? Why do they make such a fanfare of publicity about it?
Great architect of the universe, may we who are blessed remember those in need.
The truth is that for all its talk of charity, Freemasonry is mainly a social club, and each lodge is a meeting place where men of substance eat, drink, and discuss common interests. At local and national level, they probably give an average of £10 a head to non-Masonic causes, but this pales into insignificance compared with the hundreds of pounds each Mason spends every year on Masonic wining, dining, and dressing up.
I think you can truthfully say that it's no use becoming a Freemason if you haven't got a bob or two. Because if you go to your Masonic lodge and you pay for your meal, and then you go to the installations and the ladies' evenings and all the other social functions, they're not cheap, you see. Not cheap at all.
Ain't seen the sunshine, I don't know when, stuck in Folsom Prison, time keeps dragging on.
If helping worthy causes were a Mason's prime aim, he could do it just as well outside the lodge. For example, the charity country and western concerts which non-Mason John Watman and his friends put on in the early 1980s helped raise £250,000 for Stoke Mandeville Hospital. So it's poignant that this man of charity suspects he was forced into bankruptcy as a result of action by Freemasons in and around the small Oxfordshire town of Watlington. In 1982, Watman bought an old pub on the outskirts of the town. Called the Carrier's Arms, it was well known for live music. Watman started putting on different music each night, and the new venture thrived. But some local residents complained there was too much noise from the pub. The police were soon paying calls, sometimes 3 or 4 times a night.
I never found out anyone's name who had been complaining. In the end, I was just told they were anonymous calls. And really, looking back on it, the amount of time that must have been wasted on anonymous calls from Thames Valley Police was incredible, really. Just coming from Tame alone must have taken them 15 minutes. And if they're doing this 3 times a night, some nights.
A pub's drinks licence must be renewed every year. But when Watman's came up for renewal, he found out that a hostile petition had been raised in the name of a ratepayers association. He started a counter-petition, but 2 local traders told him they couldn't sign because they were in the same Masonic lodge as the man organising the petition against him, Robert Hilton. This connection was later confirmed by a confidential Masonic directory which lists Robert Hilton as a past master of Watlington's Icknield Way Lodge. It also names the 2 traders who refused to sign Watman's petition and 3 more of his neighbours. Mr. Hilton says he organised the petition on behalf of other residents, not for himself, and denies that Masons were ganging up on Watman. But Watman's drinks licence was renewed. So was his music licence, after council tests proved the music did not reach nuisance level. Even when live bands were playing, the meters proved the noisiest sound outside the pub was the squeaking of the pub sign. Yet Watman's problems got worse.
The pressure from the police was incredible. I mean, they were coming down, one particular night, they came down, I think there was 4 times in an evening, and sat outside in the car park till everyone had gone. Now, if you run a public house, it's very difficult to run it successfully if police are there all the time. And it was then I began to think they're doing it for a reason, to stop customers coming.
Convinced that police pressure was ruining business, Watman decided to quit. He closed the pub and put it on the market. But before he could find a buyer, the drinks licence had to be renewed again. This time the police objected, not because of the noise, but in effect because of the silence. They claimed the shut-down pub was a temptation to burglars. At the last minute, 7 police officers came to the court to give evidence, but as Watman's barrister had not been notified, they were not allowed to testify. Even so, the magistrates decided against him.
They were out for half an hour and they came back and decided that I didn't have a pub licence anymore.
Even though, in a sense, no evidence?
No evidence was given at all. No evidence was given against me as a person, whatever, you know.
The magistrate's decision brought financial disaster on John Watman. He had to sell the carrier's arms for £30,000 less than he paid and was forced into bankruptcy. But now he felt he was assembling more and more pieces of a Masonic jigsaw. He had long been puzzled by the attitude of Inspector Ron Duncan, who had been in charge of the officers from Thame Police Station who had paid so many visits to the carriers. But Duncan was not only a police officer, as Watman now learned from a friend who was a former policeman.
He himself was a Freemason, and he said to me, did I know that Inspector Duncan was also a Freemason from the St Mary's Lodge at Thame, where all the lodges meet in that area? And I says, no, I said I knew nothing about the Masonic there. And then he pointed out all the people that were involved with what happened to me who were Freemasons.
Watman made many complaints against Thames Valley Police, alleging harassment, but a 20-month inquiry found no evidence to justify taking any action against any officers. He's still convinced he was victimised, but the mere fact that most of the people he came up against were on the square proves not conspiracy, only coincidence. He's now back in his old job as an engineer. It's ironic that he's using Freemasonry's symbolic tools for a practical purpose, making walking aids for disabled children. Dissatisfied with the police investigation, Watman has taken his complaint to English Freemasonry's headquarters.
We looked at it, we find that there are 2 people who opposed the grant of a licence for his pub because they believed it was going to be noisy and disturb them, and those 2 people happened to be Freemasons. Nothing to do with the lodge at all.
Can you understand why, though, that he should see a Masonic conspiracy when he discovers that many of the people who he perceives to be against him, ratepayers, leaders, councillors, policemen, are all Freemasons who all meet at the same Freemasons' Hall?
I can't understand it because I know that Freemasonry isn't for that sort of thing.
Some people might think you're sort of paranoid, you're imagining the whole thing.
I think that's how they get away with it, that they like to interpret it that way. But I don't think I'm paranoid. I've stuck at it for 5 years now to try and prove in some way or another what can or what can be misused within the Masonic organisation.
Arthur Edmonds is a Freemason, but he also feels that his life has been ruined by the charitable brotherhood known as Freemasonry. He and his wife Joyce were running a travel firm called Cruise Drive Tours Limited in the 1970s, when friends suggested that they should organise cruises for Masons and their families.
You seriously declare that unbiased by the improper solicitation of friends against your own inclination, and uninfluenced by mercenary or other unworthy motive, you freely and voluntarily offer yourself as a candidate for the privileges and mysteries of Freemasonry?
I do.
I do.
At his initiation, every Mason swears not to use Freemasonry for personal profit. As a past lodge master, Arthur Edmonds was well aware of this, but the whole point of the cruises was that all profits would go to Masonic charity. It's unusual for Masons to raise money like this, but with the help of a Masonic colleague, he got clearance from Grand Lodge and advertised in the national press. The first cruise was a huge success, and a second was needed to meet demand, but Edmonds was steaming into troubled waters.
I was summoned before the Grand Secretary. I thought, oh good, I'm going to be congratulated for raising, I think by then it was about £28,000 for charities.
But the Grand Secretary at the time, James Stubbs, did not offer congratulations. According to Arthur Edmonds, the meeting, which took place here at Freemasons' Hall, was anything but pleasant. Referring to letters of complaint from a few Masons, the Grand Secretary said he was opposed to Masonic cruises in general and advertising them in particular.
I'm not having it, he said. No more. I said, no, man. Masonry teaches me to look after charities. And that's what I'm doing, quite legally and with your permission. I said, you are conducting a star chamber with me, and I won't have it. With that, I walked out of his room.
Grand Lodge then dropped a bombshell in the quarterly communication or newsletter which it sends to every English Mason. It stated,
"The board wishes to make it clear that recent advertisements and circulars about so-called Masonic cruises do not have its approval or sanction. The board strongly deprecates the association of Freemasonry with commercial ventures and does not consider that any statement that profits from such ventures will be devoted to Masonic charity affects this situation."
For Arthur and Joyce Edmonds, this was catastrophic. They'd contracted to pay £250,000 for ships for further Masonic charity cruises. But after the newsletter was read out in all lodges, bookings dried up and cancellations poured in. Edmonds was not just under attack from Grand Lodge. The very charities which had taken the money from his cruises were now denying they'd ever got any.
All of a sudden, we were having cheques returned by the charities. They wouldn't accept them. One particular one, the Masonic Hospital, stated that they could not state whether any money had ever been received from Cruise Drive Tours Limited or me. And yet before that I'd had masses of congratulatory letters and I had every receipt.
15 years earlier, Edmonds had been charged with deception and fraud in connection with another business. He says he was framed, but his barrister had strongly advised him to plead guilty and he was sentenced to 3 years in jail. The implication now that he had pocketed money destined for charity was like history repeating itself.
I myself called in Scotland Yard Fraud Squad and made them check all the books. I asked the Department of Trade and Industry to check all the books with all the bank statements and all the checks.
The fraud squad found nothing wrong, and for years Edmonds tried to clear his Masonic reputation and get a fair hearing from Grand Lodge. Eventually, the new Grand Secretary, Michael Hyam, responded in a letter that he'd seen no evidence that any charity money raised by Edmonds had been misapplied. But this didn't solve Edmonds' problem.
I couldn't contact all the Masons in England. So I asked him to produce that letter or a statement in the Grand Lodge quarterly communication, which itself had ruined me. Refused.
Mr. Edmonds asked you to reproduce that letter in the quarterly communication to clear his name. Why did you refuse to do that?
Because I didn't reckon that I was in the business of clearing his name. What we had done was to stop his cruises being described as Masonic with apparently Grand Lodge's approval. He asked me for a different assurance, and I went as far as I thought I reasonably could, and I did so in that letter.
Edmonds had been ruined. As a result of Grand Lodge's actions, Cruise Drive Tours had gone bankrupt, and he and his wife were reduced to living on the dole.
Surely they would not deliberately have destroyed your business and made you bankrupt?
I think for power, they would have done anything. And the power being that they can wield over ordinary Masons.
Not even its staunchest defenders would claim Freemasonry as democratic. But sometimes the hierarchy's preoccupation with rank and ceremonial can be offensive to ordinary brethren, such as when officers from Grand Lodge visit the more humble outposts of the craft.
These top brass come into a lodge, you have to give them salutation. And it annoys me immensely that you have to pay homage to the man. Some of them you give them 7 salutes, some 5, some 3. And then the man who is the most senior Mason will say, "We thank you for your salutations." And you know damned well he's a hypocrite.
Freemason Leonard Acklam is a past master of the Brighouse Lodge in Brighouse, Yorkshire. Now running a china shop, he was previously a plumbing and heating engineer. Some years ago, he instructed a solicitor to take action to recover a debt of £10,000. For a whole year, whenever Acklam asked what was happening, the solicitor fobbed him off with excuses, until Acklam eventually heard from a court clerk that the case had been lost by default.
It had been dropped in the bin. I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You've lost by default." How can I have lost by default? Because your solicitor had appointment at Huddersfield Crown Court with the defendant's solicitor, and your solicitor never turned up. My God. £10,000 down the drain.
Like Acklam, the solicitor who failed to turn up in court was a Freemason. As such, he should have been bound by the ritual oath to support brother Masons.
I will not injure him myself.
I will not injure him myself.
Or knowingly suffer it to be done by others.
Or knowingly suffer it to be done by others.
If in my power to prevent...
Acklam was bound by the same oath, but felt that the solicitor's negligence should not go unpunished. He sought advice on whether or not to sue his brother Mason. That's when the pressure started.
Shortly after that, I was paid a visit in my place of business by a very high-ranking Freemason. Very high-ranking. And told that if I started any action against this particular solicitor, I would lose a lot of friends. I was told I had to look on it in a true Masonic manner and forget it. After all, you can afford it. Now then, he doesn't know whether I'm skint, whether I have two halfpennies to rub together or what.
The high-ranking Mason was Sir Herbert Redfern, Grand Officer of English Freemasonry and a former chairman of the National Union of Conservative and Unionist Associations.
Why on earth would he see fit to interfere in a private dispute?
To protect his own Masonic member. Nothing anymore. You see, I'm a nobody. I'm not a high-ranking Freemason. I'm the fellow with the pick and shovel that does the work. If you see what I mean. I mean, these are the fellows that go and sit on the top table and shout how wonderful Freemasonry is, and then go back to the hypocrisy when they've taken their Masonic pinny off and the Masonic collar and the Masonic gloves.
Acklam was so outraged by Redfern's interference in a private dispute and the use of Masonic pressure that he protested to the Provincial Grand Lodge and then to Grand Lodge in London. An internal Masonic inquiry has just been set up, but Sir Herbert's now dead, and it's 8 years since Acklam first complained about attempted Masonic blackmail.
Why do you think Grand Lodge and the Yorkshire West Riding have done nothing about it?
Because of the rank of the man involved. I mean, he was closely associated with the Prime Minister, Cabinet Ministers. He's a very, very top man, was a top man. He's chairman of the magistrates. He's a very top man, not only a top Freemason, but a man with muscle, if you like.
Mr. Acklam, in a general sense, says that he believes that there is one law for those at the top of Freemasonry and that the rank and file are treated in a totally different way. How do you react to that charge?
I don't think that I can agree with it. At least in theory, the thing happens the same for everybody. And we are still trying to find out what Mr. Acklam is, the truth of Mr. Acklam's complaints.
In practice, is everybody treated the same?
I'd like to think so.
Like John Watman and Arthur Edmonds, Leonard Acklam is typical of hundreds of people, many of them staunch Masons, who believe, rightly or wrongly, that the Brotherhood has interfered with their business or destroyed their livelihood. Sometimes truth, relief and brotherly love seem a bit thin on the ground.
I believe that the ordinary members of Freemasonry, generally speaking, you'll always find the black sheep, are genuine and good. But the higher they get in the rank, the more they seem to change, to become little Hitlers. They're just little dictators who tell you what to do and will not listen to a single word. They don't even ask your defence till afterwards.
Brotherly love, relief and truth. That is Freemasonry. And I'm afraid we've too many men at the top who do not believe in brotherly love, relief and truth. They believe in themselves. What is in it for me?
Worshipful Master, I present to you Mr. Martin, a candidate properly prepared to be made a Mason.
Many of the 500,000 men initiated into Freemasonry in Britain are involved in local government. But is there a conflict of interest between Freemasonry's secret oaths and the public service?
Do you seriously declare on your honour that, unbiased by the improper solicitation of friends, against your own inclination, and uninfluenced by mercenary or other unworthy motive, you freely and voluntarily offer yourself as a candidate for the privileges and mysteries of Freemasonry?
I do.
I do.
The averred aims of Freemasonry are highly moral ones. The only problem arises in that they also insist that you should support the group, fellowship with other Masons. The message is you can't stand on your own. You need us. And you can quite see that the thought of being out in the world naked without that would be very frightening, and that some people might well let loyalties to other more abstract institutions go by the wayside.
By thy glorious majesty.
The English language is littered with Masonic phrases like being on the level, upright and true, and getting a square deal. Masonry's symbolic tools are supposed to be reminders of its moral code. But up and down the country there have been allegations of Masonic corruption in local authorities, from Cardiff to Bradford, from the north of Scotland to the south of England. Southend on the Thames estuary is typical of many seaside resorts. It seems to be virtually controlled by Freemasons. The Masonic Hall houses 43 craft lodges, 23 Royal Arch chapters, and many other Masonic orders. This town of 50,000 adult males contains 3,000 Masons from every walk of life. But do Southend's other residents know anything about Freemasons?
It's like a lodge, isn't it, where people go, you know, you want to get on a bit. You're a Freemason, aren't you? And you're Masonics.
Brother speaks for brother, don't they?
Yes. Secret society, yeah.
What do they do?
Not a lot. Not a lot, no.
They shake
Well,
hands.
it's so secret we don't know what they do.
Yeah, they do. They stick
They've
to
got a
one
special.
another, don't
Yes,
they?
more. They've got a special handshake. They
Why?
wear silly leather pinnies and no secret society.
How powerful do you think they are in Southend?
Probably fairly powerful, I should imagine. There's a lot of very wealthy people about here that are very interested in doing that sort of thing.
Bunch of bastards. Two men. The firm I work for is mainly run by Masons. Unfortunately, that led to a lot of people who aren't particularly good at their job getting into influential places.
Well, they're all over the place down here, everywhere you go.
Do you know who the Freemasons are?
Yes.
Yes, so we
Of course
do.
we do.
What sort of firm do you work in? I wouldn't like to say, especially on camera. But you know who you are, don't you?
One of Southend's most eminent Masons is William Muckley, an ardent member of Crowstone Lodge, number 3298. For most of his working life, he was employed by Southend Council, and for 10 years he controlled all the town's council house allocations. But in 1979, Mr. Muckley moved in with his mistress in a council house she had just been allocated by his very own department. Muckley thereby attracted the attention of Paul Foote of the Daily Mirror.
That's how it started. I think we then found a number of other cases. In fact, one of the nastiest cases that occurred there, which wasn't to do with Muckley himself, but with one of his junior officials, was clear evidence that one of the junior housing officers there was housing divorced women and single parents in exchange for sexual favours, a thing which you can't imagine anything really more disgusting at that level. You can't imagine anything more revolting than that. And we exposed that as well. And I think all these things had roots in Masonry, Freemasonry.
Foote's revelations caused outrage in Southend. One Conservative councillor, Chris Hudson, was inundated with letters from angry constituents. He's not a Mason. He was concerned about the newspaper's allegations and called for an independent inquiry into the conduct of Mr. Muckley and the Housing Department. But Southend's Masons closed ranks.
It is an established fact from Masonic records that members within the Housing Department, officers, were Masons. That's just a question of historical fact. And it is a fact that several of my colleagues, former colleagues on the council, were Masons. And they stuck together like glue.
Only days after the revelations in the Daily Mirror, Brother Muckley was installed as Worshipful Master of Crowstone Lodge. He was also promoted to Chief Housing Officer by Southend Council and given a large salary increase. At the same time, Councillor Hudson's pleas for an independent inquiry into Masonic abuse were turned down by the same council, and he was suspended by his Conservative colleagues from every committee on which he sat.
Their behaviour, their conduct in this town, as regards me and my position as a councillor, was appalling. I was shocked and appalled. I was very concerned at the press this town was getting. I did everything I could to have an inquiry, and yet certain members within the Freemasonry wanted to keep the lid on things, keep the can of worms quiet, if you like, down in Southend.
Hudson took his suspension to the High Court. He claimed that democracy was being bypassed in Southend, partly as a result of the cosy, back-scratching relationships enjoyed in the town's Masonic lodges. The High Court upheld his complaint and instructed that Councillor Hudson be reinstated. Worshipful Brother Muckley was made redundant from his post as Chief Housing Officer in 1985. Southend said they had too many chief officers and he was nearing retirement. Since then, he's worked at a garage, but has just been given a job as a physical and recreational instructor at a local coeducational high school. Muckley's lodge meets at Southend's Masonic Temple, as do many other lodges. For these brethren, Freemasonry may be harmless socializing, but not to some outsiders.
Because they mingle in secret and because they tie one another up in this secret bond to one another, the tendency among all these people that are in this secret society is to defend one another rather than to expose one another to public accountability.
Accountability is very important in local government because councils spend huge amounts of ratepayers' money. Newham Council in the East End of London has an annual budget bigger than many third world countries. In 1980, a full roll of 75 members of the Borough of Newham Lodge leaked out. Non-Masons were horrified to discover the extent of Freemasonry's influence in the Labour-controlled borough.
It actually permeated the whole social fabric of the borough. The membership of the lodge indicated that there were members of the council, senior members of the council in membership. There were the officers, the senior officers and lower officers. There were contractors. There were even police connections.
Newham is just one of many councils with town hall lodges attached, where elected councillors, council officials and outside contractors meet in Masonic secrecy. But it isn't only the obvious town hall lodges which raise anxieties. In Rochford, Essex, a conservative stronghold, Masonic influence has been the subject of stormy debate. Councillor Richard Boyd, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, contends that Freemasonry in Rochford is the Tory party in disguise, and that Tory councillors meet council officers in the same Masonic lodge.
There is a standing tradition in local government that paid officials do not attend caucus meetings of political parties. The reason is to prevent undue influence by one party on officials or the ability of one party to obtain information, privy information, which is not made available to others. Now, if that rule is followed, it becomes illogical if you then all nip down to the Masonic lodge that evening and the members are from one party and paid officials. It destroys that attempt to separate political life from private life.
Boyd became concerned about Masonic influence in 1982, when the old council chamber was sold to local Masons without being put on the open market. It's now a Masonic temple. At least 4 conservative councillors who were on the committee which authorised the sale were also Freemasons, but saw no need to declare an interest. We asked all these men about their conduct. None would respond, but a Mason who's become a councillor since the decision argues that Masonic councillors are under no obligation to declare themselves.
First of all, I think it is an impertinence to ask me as an individual what I do with my free time and my free money if I'm partaking in something which is not illegal or immoral, and Freemasonry is neither of these things. The next thing that we shall be asked to define is how much money we give to various charities, whether we drink South African sherry, etc. Where is the line drawn?
If there's a planning application concerning my wife, I declare an interest. If there's a planning application to turn the redundant council chamber of Rochford into a Masonic meeting place, which they buy, I would expect members of the Masonic movement to declare an interest. Well, they didn't.
Despite many Freemasons' protests, the issue of concealed membership is very often at the root of public mistrust of the Brotherhood, especially so in job promotions, when a Masonic candidate is found to have been chosen by other Freemasons. The 1981 appointment of Alf Parish as Chief Constable of Derbyshire was a case in point.
Really quite bizarre. Mr. Parish was appointed Chief Constable in a rather strange way. Many of us thought with undue haste at the time. Sadly, the Chief Constable at the time had tragically died of a heart attack. It was in April of 1981, and we were conscious that in May of 1981 there was likely to be a change of control of the County Council.
The new Chief Constable was hastily appointed by a subcommittee dominated by the ruling Tory group, which looked likely to lose the forthcoming elections. Parish had been the serving Deputy Chief. It could be argued he was likely to have got the top job anyway, but his was not the only rushed promotion.
That was followed by an even more startling appointment of Mr. Parish's deputy, Mr. Parkinson, who was appointed literally hours before the election, just one day, without proper adverts to satisfy the Home Office, and in spite of some considerable criticism from the Home Office, again it appeared that there was undue influence in both of those appointments.
With the new Chief Constable and his deputy now firmly ensconced at police headquarters, Labour gained its predicted victory and David Bookbinder became council leader. But not until 3 years later, when Bookbinder was sent a photocopy of the Derbyshire Masonic Yearbook, did he feel the mystery of Parish's selection was explained. Prominent in the list of Derby Masons was the name of Alf S. Parish, but there were also the members of the subcommittee which selected him. The Tory chairman, Angus MacDonald Miller, turned out to be a grand provincial officer of the craft. Also on the committee were the Masonic Tory councillors Royden Green and Walter Marshall, formerly the Conservative leader of the County Council. Even the Home Office inspector attached to the committee, James Page, was a Mason in London. But by this time, Brother Alf Parish's tenure as Derby's Chief Constable was coming to a spectacular climax. Parish was retired in 1985 amid a scandal relating to over £30,000 expenses. But the Derbyshire Masonic Yearbook explained many other mysteries of county politics. For example, the membership list for the Tyrian Lodge, number 253, the county's oldest, which meets here at the Masonic Hall in Derby, included 2 former Conservative County Council leaders, 3 successive county clerks who had run the council for more than 20 years, the High Sheriff and the former Chief Constable Sir Walter Stansfield. Clearly, some Tyrian Lodge members had dominated county affairs throughout the 1960s and 70s. Other names loomed out from other lodges, yet more Conservative councillors, the Lord Lieutenant and the Duke of Devonshire. These confidential Masonic papers disclosed a business, political, police and social directory of the entire county. They revealed Freemasonry's extraordinary power in Derbyshire and its effective role as the county's secret government.
You could say that it was the informal controlling body of Derbyshire County Council. It certainly successfully had its members appointed in their most sensitive and key positions that exist in this authority. It could all be a coincidence, but it really would be a very remarkable one.
The Tyrian Lodge of Derby does seem to contain a substantial slice of Derbyshire's ruling elite.
I hear what you say, but I could also tell you that Freemasons are taught from the very beginning of their Masonic activity that they're not to use Freemasonry to advance any sort of interest. The lodge may contain some important people, but that's an accident. They're not there to influence any sort of exercise any sort of influence at all.
It was no accident that certain Freemasons exercised a corrupt influence over many English local councils in the 1960s. That's when the Pontefract architect John Poulson scooped up contract after contract by bribing local and national politicians. But when he was jailed for corruption in 1974, his Masonic connections were scarcely known, and he's written to us denying that Freemasonry ever helped him in business.
I was an enthusiastic, loyal member of my lodge for many years. I found Masonry fascinating, and I gave myself enthusiastically to its service. I can only say I did not use Masonry to further my business interest.
Poulson's right-hand man and public relations fixer during the 1960s was the flamboyant T. Dan Smith, one-time boss of Newcastle City Council and dubbed by the press Mr. Newcastle. A non-Mason himself, Smith contradicts his one-time paymaster by claiming that Poulson became a Mason in order to make contact with influential Labour politicians.
He said to me, I'm not a Mason, but I'm going to become a Mason, because he said, Joe Blackburn, who is the mayor of Pontefract, I think was the mayor of Pontefract, and also the leader of the Pontefract Council, has convinced me that there are so many Labour Party local authority people Masons that I must have some means of contact because I'm known to be a Tory. And I believe that I'm right to be a Tory, and I'm not going to compromise on politics.
For some Yorkshire citizens, the legacy of the Poulson affair is a deep distrust of Freemasons in politics. In 1986, 3 Bradford researchers uncovered long-buried evidence of Masonic opportunism over council plans to build a bypass through the Leeds suburb of Headingley.
I think what we've always been interested in, and I think most ordinary people are interested in, is what are the backroom deals? What is the wheeling and dealing?
In the 1960s, Masonic wheeling and dealing involved a 5-acre plot of land, which was worth very little because it was inaccessible by road. But then Leeds Council earmarked half the land for a new bypass. The proposed road would give direct access to the rest of the plot, which would then rocket in value as prime building land. 20 years later, in the unlikely setting of a suburban bedroom, the 3 researchers began a painstaking investigation of company and council records, as well as confidential Masonic documents. They discovered that in 1966, 12 local Masonic lodges had banded together to form the Shire Oak Property Company in order to buy the 5 acres of land in Headingley.
That's the London one. So how were they divided up between local individuals and...
I think they seem to got rid of most of the shares to the actual lodges themselves in trust.
Many of the all-Masonic shareholders in the Shire Oak Company were Leeds councillors, and so in a good position to know the council's plans for the bypass. They included Alderman John Astle, JP, on the Transport Committee, Councillor Donald Bradley, Finance and Planning Committee, Lord Mayor and Alderman Alan Bretherick, Councillor Harold Jowett, Finance and Planning Committee, and Erwin Bellow, council leader from 1975 to 1979, when Mrs. Thatcher made him Lord Belwyn and Minister for Local Government. In 1974, Leeds Council set up a voluntary register of councillors' interests.
Not one of these councillors had ever declared their interest in this matter, and really that's what the registers of interest was set up to protect against people with inside information and inside influence on decisions actually profiting from decisions made at the council.
But as the 3 researchers found out, the Shire Oak Masons were to come unstuck. In 1976, Britain's Labour government announced huge cutbacks on road building. The local bypass was shelved, the value of the land slumped, and the Masons eventually had to sell out without making a profit. Even so, it is a matter of public concern that so many councillors had shares in a company which would benefit from their own council's decisions. Yet when the Shire Oak deal was exposed in 1986, the leaders of what was by then a Labour-controlled council did nothing to investigate their Tory forerunners.
It just seems like it's become par for the course, really, and I don't think it should. I think we ought to get to the point where we're shocked by things like this, and we're really not that shocked anymore.
The public may no longer be shocked by shadowy deals done in our local town halls, but we still like to think our national civil servants are incorruptible. Yet Freemasonry, which claims to demand high standards, is sometimes the breeding ground for corruption on a grand scale in the civil service. The Property Services Agency has an annual budget of £1 billion and employs 26,000 civil servants. It manages and maintains more than 8,000 public buildings, including the Tower of London and Hampton Court Palace. Recently, corrupt deals involving the PSA were hatched and executed under the cover of the Queenswood Lodge, which now meets here at London's Freemasons' Hall. By the early 1980s, it was a honeypot for building contractors and corrupt civil servants. A key figure in the scandal was a contractor called Terry King. In 1981, King and a PSA officer, Eric Wenborn, were guests at a Queenswood Lodge ladies' night. Within a few months, both the builder and the civil servant were initiated as apprentice masons.
Having been kept for a considerable time in a state of darkness, what in your present situation is the predominant wish in your heart?
Light. Light.
Brother Junior Deacon, let that blessing be restored to the candidate.
While in a state of darkness, Wenborn had worked incorruptibly as a civil servant for 35 years. But within a year of becoming a Mason, he was flying off to Las Vegas, all expenses paid, courtesy of his crooked builder brothers in the Queenswood Lodge. In June 1988, at the Old Bailey, Wenborn pleaded guilty to 5 charges of corruption and conspiracy to obtain bribes. The jury heard how, throughout 1983, his Masonic brothers had paid £1,000 a month into a Jersey bank account in his wife's name, about another free holiday in Miami, how he bought his mistress a £33,000 flat with his bribes, as well as spending money on his own home and buying himself a new car. Brother Eric Wenborn was eventually jailed for 2 years, a sad end to a civil service career that had spanned 4 decades.
What inquiries have been made by Grand Lodge following the recent court revelations of the involvement of a Masonic lodge in a network of bribery and corruption in the Property Services Agency?
Freemasons who were convicted by the court have been dealt with and expelled, and we've inquired into the affairs of one lodge which seemed to be concerned, and we find that there was nothing Masonically improper about it, and we are now inquiring into the affairs of another one. But we expect that we'll find, as we did in the first lodge, that there was nothing in the lodge which encouraged these people or allowed them to break the law.
Is this the Queenswood Lodge?
I can't remember which one of the two it is we sorted out.
In the Queenswood Lodge there were 2 contractors, 1 PSA official and 1 GLC official, and all were convicted of bribery and corruption.
Yes. That doesn't mean to say that the lodge caused them or allowed them or helped them to be conspirators. It's just an accident of life that these people happen to be in the same lodge. There might be a lot of other organisations that they belong to the same. It might be nice to think they all go to the same church.
However nice it might be, these corrupt men did not all go to the same church. They did all go to the same lodge. But does it really matter if some Freemasons in public service have failed to meet the high standards of morality which the Brotherhood proclaims? Should the public care about petty Masonic abuse of power, such as afflicted Southend's housing department?
The scandal itself may well seem petty, but underneath that petty scandal is a basic principle, and it's the principle that democracy can be strangled. And if it can be happening here in petty Southend, as we say, then what could be happening in other corridors of power on a more senior level? What happens in Southend could well be happening in Parliament. We need more open government to get at the truth. We represent the people, we are here in the name of the people, and we cannot have secret societies operating within a framework of democracy. It's a paradox, it's a nonsense.